Hey guys, tonight we begin with what it was really like to be a teenager in Nazi Germany. Think high school was rough? Try navigating puberty while your government literally makes it illegal to not salute properly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because tonight, we're diving into a world where detention meant deportation, and your biggest worry wasn't acne. It was accidentally saying the wrong thing about the Führer. Let's start with the biggest misconception about teenage life in Nazi Germany. Most people imagine it was either complete horror for everyone, or that German kids were all mindless little robots marching around in perfect formation, shouting Heil Hitler with gleaming eyes. In reality, the teenage experience was far more complicated and, frankly, bizarre than Hollywood would have you believe. Think of it like this. Imagine your worst helicopter parent, multiply that by 1,000,000, give them absolute power over your country, and then add matching uniforms for everyone. That was essentially the Nazi approach to youth. This wasn't some dystopian novel where every kid was a perfect little Nazi soldier from day one. It was messy, contradictory, and often absurd. You had kids who genuinely bought into the propaganda, living next door to kids who were secretly listening to banned jazz music. You had teenagers worried about their disastrous perms while their Jewish classmates disappeared. You had 15-year-old girls going to the cinema while bombs fell on their city, because apparently the movie theater was still showing the latest romantic comedy and, well, priorities. The reality was that teenagers did what teenagers have always done. They tried to live their lives, have fun, fall in love, and figure out who they were. Except they had to do it in a society that was actively trying to program them into becoming either perfect Aryan breeding machines or cannon fodder for the war effort. And if you think modern teenagers are dramatic, wait until you hear about kids who had to write essays titled, "Why Am I Not in the Hitler Youth?" when they didn't join the mandatory youth organization. 1933 to 1945 was, to put it mildly, not the best time to be coming of age in Germany. The country wasn't the modern, democratic nation we know today. It was a totalitarian state run by a failed art student with a distinctive mustache and some very strong opinions about pretty much everything. The Nazi Party controlled not just the government, but every aspect of daily life, including what kids learned in school, what they did after school, and even what they thought about while they were supposed to be sleeping. If you thought your parents were controlling, Hitler literally wanted to control every German child's mind. His government banned the Boy Scouts. Yes, the actual Boy Scouts were apparently too subversive for Nazi Germany, and replaced them with organizations that were basically military training camps disguised as summer camps. They rewrote textbooks so that math problems involved calculating how much money the state supposedly wasted on disabled people. They made it illegal for Jewish children to attend the same schools as non-Jewish children, then gradually made it illegal for them to attend any schools at all. The Hitler Youth, which started as an optional organization, became mandatory by 1939. By that point, over 90% of German children were members. Not necessarily because they wanted to be, but because the alternative was social exile, academic failure, and having very disappointed parents who didn't want a visit from the authorities, asking awkward questions about their child-rearing techniques. Meanwhile, the adult world was becoming increasingly unhinged. The government was preparing for a war that would consume Europe, implementing racial laws that would lead to genocide, and creating a surveillance state where children were encouraged to report on their own parents if they said anything insufficiently patriotic. It was like living in a society where your worst middle school rumors could get someone sent to a concentration camp. And through all of this, teenagers still had to deal with the usual teenage problems: acne, homework, crushes, and figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. Except now their career options were basically limited to soldier, baby-making machine, or disappear mysteriously in the night. The Nazi vision for youth was crystal clear. Boys would become warriors, girls would become mothers, and anyone who didn't fit that mold would face consequences that made being grounded look like a vacation. Meet Brigitte Eick, a 15-year-old Berlin schoolgirl whose diary gives us a fascinating window into just how surreal teenage life could be in Nazi Germany. Brigitte was basically the 1940s equivalent of that friend we all had who seemed completely oblivious to drama happening right around them. While her city was being bombed and her Jewish neighbors were being deported, Brigitte was primarily concerned with more pressing matters, like whether her perm looked good and what movie was playing at the local cinema on February 1st, 1944. After her school was literally bombed, Brigitte and her friends decided the appropriate response was to dance to gramophone records. Because apparently, nothing says maintaining morale during wartime like an impromptu dance party in the rubble. When a bombing in March 1943 killed 2 people, injured 34, and made over 1,000 homeless, Brigitte's diary entry was essentially, "Wow, that was annoying. I was trying to sleep," but perhaps most telling was her reaction to major historical events happening around her. In November 1944, while Hitler was planning the Ardennes offensive, his last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war, Brigitte was having a complete meltdown about her hair. Her diary entry from that time period is genuinely focused on her disastrous perm. Imagine being so wrapped up in your appearance that you're more concerned about your hair than the fact that your country is losing a world war. On March 2nd, 1945, with the Soviet army just 60 miles from Berlin and the Third Reich collapsing around her, Brigitte went to the movies. The cinema was apparently still open, still showing films, and still selling tickets while enemy forces approached the capital. It's like going to see the latest superhero movie while your house is on fire. The only time Brigitte mentioned the systematic deportation of Berlin's Jewish population in her entire diary was a single entry on February 27, 1943. Jews all over town being taken away, including the tailor across the road. That's it. No horror, no concern, no recognition that she was witnessing genocide. Just a casual observation, like noting that the weather was cloudy or that she'd run out of milk. Years later, at age 86, Brigitte reflected on her wartime experience with a statement that perfectly captures the strange bubble many German teenagers lived in. "My son always said to me, 'How could you be so oblivious?' But I never saw a thing." She genuinely believed she hadn't witnessed the atrocities happening literally across the street from her house. Sound familiar? It's the historical equivalent of someone today saying they had no idea about a major news story because they don't follow politics and were too busy with TikTok. Except in Brigitte's case, the news story she missed was the Holocaust, and her TikTok was dance parties and hair care. And if you think that level of willful obliviousness was unique to Brigitte, well, you're in for a long night, because this was more common than you might expect. This wasn't just about teenagers being teenagers in difficult circumstances. What was happening to German youth represented nothing less than the systematic attempt to rebuild human society from the ground up, starting with children. The Nazi Party understood something that most governments miss. If you want to control a society completely, you don't start with adults who already have formed opinions and established beliefs. You start with kids. The Hitler Youth wasn't just an after-school activity. It was a comprehensive program designed to replace family, church and school as the primary influence on young people's development. By 1939, membership was mandatory for all Aryan children, and the organization had become so central to German life that parents who refused to let their children join faced investigation by authorities. Think about that. The government could literally question your parenting if your kid didn't want to join what was essentially a military training program disguised as a youth group. The consequences rippled through every aspect of society. Jewish children found themselves completely isolated from their former friends and classmates. Non-Jewish children who didn't embrace Nazi ideology faced social ostracism, academic penalties, and sometimes violence from their peers. And children who fully bought into the program, they were being systematically trained to become either instruments of genocide or cannon fodder for a war machine that would consume an entire generation. What makes this particularly chilling is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. Brigitte Eich's obliviousness wasn't unique. It was the product of a system that made atrocity seem mundane and resistance seem impossible. When being a normal teenager means participating in your own indoctrination, and when questioning authority can get your family arrested, the stakes aren't just personal. They're civilization-level. The Nazi experiment with German youth was ultimately an attempt to answer a terrifying question. Can you reprogram an entire generation to abandon empathy, critical thinking, and basic human decency? And for a while, it looked like the answer might be yes. But Brigitte's story of willful ignorance was just one side of the teenage experience in Nazi Germany. For every oblivious Berlin schoolgirl dancing through the apocalypse, there were thousands of other young people having very different experiences. Some were true believers, throwing themselves into Nazi ideology with the passionate intensity that only teenagers can muster. Others were reluctant participants, going through the motions to avoid trouble. And still others were active resistors, risking everything to maintain their humanity in an increasingly inhuman world. The most powerful tool the Nazis had for shaping young minds wasn't fear or force, though they certainly used plenty of both. It was something much more seductive, the promise of belonging, purpose, and importance. They offered teenagers what every teenager desperately wants: to be part of something bigger than themselves, to feel special and chosen, to have clear rules and clear enemies. And for millions of German young people, that offer was irresistible. The Hitler Youth grew from 2.3 million members in 1933 to over 8 million by 1940. And while membership became mandatory, many kids were eager to join long before they had to. To understand why, we need to look at how the Nazis packaged their ideology for young people, and how they made evil seem not just normal, but exciting. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Nazi youth organizations. They were really good at marketing to teenagers, unlike the grim, militaristic image we often have today. The early Hitler Youth actually looked like a lot of fun. Think about it from a 1930s kid's perspective. You're living in a country still recovering from economic depression. Your parents are stressed about money and politics. School is boring. And suddenly, there's this new organization that promises adventure, camaraderie, and the chance to be part of something historically important. The Nazis didn't start by teaching kids to hate. They started by teaching kids to belong. They took all the appealing elements of organizations like the Boy Scouts, camping, hiking, singing around campfires, learning practical skills, and supercharged them with patriotic purpose and military-style discipline. Instead of earning merit badges for not tying, you earned recognition for physical fitness and ideological purity. Instead of camping for fun, you were training to serve the fatherland. Alphonse Heck, who joined the Jungvolk at age 10, later reflected that it seemed like an exciting life, free from parental supervision, filled with duties that seemed sheer pleasure. The activities included precision marching, hiking, camping, war games, and constant sports. Basically everything a young boy might find exciting, with just enough structure to make kids feel important and grown up dot. The genius of the system was that it gave teenagers exactly what they craved: independence from parents, clear rules and hierarchies, physical challenges, and social status among their peers. It was like the world's most successful after-school program, except the ultimate goal was turning children into instruments of totalitarian control. And for many kids, especially in the early years, that darker purpose was either hidden or seen, like a distant concern compared to the immediate fun of belonging to something bigger than themselves. Take Hans Wolf, whose story was actually published in Nazi school textbooks as an example of proper Hitler youth values. During a long, hot march, Hans noticed that their group leader shared his water with struggling younger boys and helped carry their equipment. The story, titled Comradeship, was designed to show how the Hitler Youth built character and mutual support among German boys. And honestly, it probably did build genuine friendships and teach some positive values, which made the whole thing even more insidious. The Nazi youth organizations were deliberately designed to mimic positive aspects of traditional youth groups, while gradually introducing ideological elements. Boys learned practical skills like map reading, first aid, and outdoor survival, genuinely useful knowledge that would serve them well regardless of political context. They participated in sports competitions, music festivals, and community service projects. On the surface, much of it looked like any other youth organization, but then there were the tests of courage. Alphonse Heck described one particularly memorable initiation ritual where boys were required to dive headfirst from a 10-foot platform into water. It was terrifying, but completing it meant you belonged. You were tough enough, brave enough, German enough. And when you successfully completed the dive, they handed you a dagger inscribed with blood and honor. Suddenly, the swimming test becomes a lot more ominous when you realize it was preparation for a mindset where physical courage and symbolic violence were linked. The girls' organization, the League of German Girls, focused on different but equally seductive themes. Instead of military-style training, girls participated in what the Nazis called collective athletics, rhythmic gymnastics, folk dancing, and outdoor activities that emphasized teamwork and physical fitness. They learned practical domestic skills like sewing, cooking, and childcare, which were presented as preparation for their future roles as wives and mothers. One former League member recalled the intoxicating feeling of participating in massive, synchronized demonstrations where thousands of girls moved in perfect unison while patriotic music played. We felt like we were part of something magnificent and eternal, she remembered. It was beautiful and powerful, and we felt beautiful and powerful being part of it. It's easy to understand the appeal. Imagine being a teenage girl in the 1930s, when women had limited opportunities, suddenly being told that your role in creating the future of your nation was crucial and honored. The summer camps were particularly effective at building loyalty and indoctrination. Away from parental influence, kids lived in a completely Nazi-controlled environment where every activity reinforced the organization's values. They sang Nazi songs around campfires, participated in ideological discussions disguised as games, and formed intense friendships with other members. Many participants described these camps as the best experiences of their childhoods, but underneath all the positive experiences, darker elements were gradually introduced. Map reading exercises focused on territories Germany planned to conquer. First aid training emphasized treating battle wounds. Folk songs included lyrics about purifying the race and eliminating enemies. Physical fitness activities were explicitly described as preparation for military service. The community service projects often involved distributing anti-Semitic propaganda or participating in boycotts of Jewish businesses. The most chilling aspect was how normal it all seemed to the participants. Years later, many former Hitler Youth members struggled to reconcile their genuinely positive memories of friendship, adventure, and belonging with the knowledge that they were being systematically prepared to participate in genocide and aggressive war. They remembered having fun, feeling important, and forming lifelong friendships, and they weren't wrong about those experiences. The Nazi youth organizations were genuinely effective at providing positive social experiences for members, which made the ideological manipulation even more powerful. But it wasn't that simple, because of course it wasn't. Not every German teenager bought into the program, and not every family supported their children's participation. Some parents, like Johannes Fest, actively opposed Nazi ideology and worked to shield their children from indoctrination. Fest told his son, "Hitler is the misfortune of Germany, and whoever serves him serves evil." But these parents faced an impossible situation. They had to protect their children from a system that demanded total participation while avoiding the attention of authorities who could destroy their families. The experience varied dramatically depending on your background and beliefs. If you were Jewish, you couldn't join at all, which meant automatic social isolation from your former friends and classmates. If you were from a religious family, you might find yourself torn between church teachings and Nazi ideology. If you were naturally rebellious or independent-minded, you might chafe against the rigid conformity and constant surveillance. Some teenagers found creative ways to resist or subvert the system. The Edelweiss Pirates, an estimated 5,000 young people, defied Nazi authority by organizing illegal hiking groups, distributing anti-war graffiti, and sometimes engaging in more serious resistance activities. In 1944, 6 Edelweiss pirates were hanged in Cologne without trial. Teenagers executed for refusing to conform. Then there were the swing kids, who embraced American and British jazz music that the Nazis had banned as degenerate. They developed their own subculture around dancing, fashion, and music that directly contradicted Nazi values about racial purity and cultural superiority. For these kids, rebellion looked like listening to Benny Goodman records and dancing in a style the government considered un-German. Even within the Hitler Youth itself, there were contradictions and complexities. Some members, like Hans Schall, who later founded the White Rose resistance movement, initially embraced Nazi ideology, but gradually became disillusioned as they witnessed the regime's true nature. Others went through the motions without ever truly believing, treating it like an elaborate game they had to play to get by. Parents faced particularly difficult choices. Those who refused to allow their children to join faced investigation by authorities and social ostracism from neighbors. But parents who allowed their children to participate watched them come home spouting ideology that contradicted everything the family believed. Some families developed coded ways of communicating their true beliefs at home while maintaining the facade of Nazi support in public. The most tragic contradiction was that many of the positive values the Hitler Youth claimed to promote, loyalty, courage, service to others, physical fitness, love of nature, were genuine goods that could have flourished in a different context. The Nazis were expert at taking legitimate human desires for community, purpose, and belonging and twisting them toward evil ends. The result was a generation of German young people who came of age in a state of manufactured moral confusion. By 1940, over 8 million children belonged to Hitler Youth organizations, nearly every eligible Aryan child in Germany. For most of them, Nazi ideology wasn't something imposed from outside. It was simply the normal background of their formative years. The psychological consequences were profound and long-lasting. Children learned that absolute obedience to authority was the highest virtue, that questioning official ideology was dangerous and unpatriotic, and that their individual desires and beliefs were less important than their duty to the collective. They were systematically trained to suppress empathy for designated enemies and to view violence in service of the state as noble and necessary. Teachers reported that students became increasingly militant and intolerant of dissent. Children who had been raised in religious households began rejecting their families' beliefs in favor of Nazi racial ideology. Some actually denounced their own parents to authorities when they expressed doubt about government policies. The Hitler Youth became a way for Nazi ideology to penetrate directly into the family unit, creating conflict and surveillance within the most intimate relationships. The educational system reinforced these changes at every level. Jewish teachers were fired, and remaining teachers were pressured to join the National Socialist Teachers League. By 1936, over 97% had complied. New curricula and textbooks infused Nazi racism into every subject, including mathematics word problems that calculated the supposed cost of caring for disabled people. Students who refused to participate in Nazi activities faced academic penalties, social isolation, and sometimes physical violence from their peers. For Jewish children, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Prohibited from joining youth organizations, increasingly isolated in schools, and eventually banned from education entirely. They watched their former friends embrace an ideology that defined them as subhuman enemies. Many Jewish families emigrated if they could afford to do so, leaving behind everything they had built in Germany. The broader German society gradually adapted to a new normal, where children monitored their parents, were expressing doubt about government policies could result in investigation, and where teenagers were systematically prepared for war and genocide. The transformation wasn't immediate or total. There were always holdouts, resistors, and people who maintained some perspective on what was happening. But for millions of families, the Nazi youth program succeeded in their primary goal, creating a generation that would serve the regime without question. The most chilling consequence was how ordinary it all became. Parents adjusted to their children coming home with Nazi songs and slogans. Teachers learned to incorporate racial ideology into lesson plans. Communities organized their social lives around Hitler Youth events and Nazi celebrations. What had initially seemed shocking and extreme gradually became the unquestioned background of daily life. Meanwhile, as German teenagers were being systematically indoctrinated into Nazi ideology through youth organizations, another transformation was taking place in classrooms across the country. The Nazis understood that controlling after-school activities wasn't enough. They needed to reshape education itself to serve their ideological goals. The changes to German schools were swift and comprehensive, touching everything from textbooks to teacher training to classroom decorations. What had once been institutions focused on learning and intellectual development became instruments of political control and racial indoctrination. And for students who found themselves on the wrong side of Nazi racial laws, these changes meant the difference between education and exclusion, between belonging and exile. The classroom became another battleground in the Nazi war for young minds, where academic subjects were weaponized to serve political ends and where children learned that their worth as human beings depended on their racial classification and ideological compliance. To understand how completely the Nazis transformed teenage life in Germany, we need to see how they turned education from a force for enlightenment into a tool for manufacturing hatred. If the Hitler Youth was the carrot, then the transformation of German schools was the stick. While youth organizations seduced teenagers with promises of adventure and belonging, the educational system bludgeoned them with ideology disguised as academic learning. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, they moved quickly to transform every classroom in Germany into a propaganda factory, and they did it with the efficiency that would make any modern education reformer weep with envy. The the changes weren't subtle. Within months, Jewish teachers were fired from their positions, not just demoted or reassigned, but completely removed from the profession. Meanwhile, remaining teachers were encouraged to join the National Socialist Teachers League, and by 1936, over 97% had complied. Think about that number for a moment. In 3 years, the Nazis achieved near-total ideological compliance among German educators. It makes you wonder what they offered that was so compelling, or what they threatened that was so terrifying. The Nazis created entirely new curricula and textbooks, because apparently regular math and science weren't sufficiently focused on racial superiority and German nationalism. Students now took mandatory classes in race science, learning to measure skulls and categorize human beings like livestock. Nazi racism wasn't just added to the curriculum, it was infused into every subject. Literature classes focused on German authors who promoted approved themes. History classes emphasized German victimhood and racial destiny. Even mathematics problems were designed to reinforce Nazi ideology. But perhaps most insidiously, the Nazis understood that controlling what children learned wasn't enough. They had to control how children thought. The goal wasn't just to teach specific facts or beliefs, but to train a generation of Germans who would automatically, reflexively think in terms of racial categories, national loyalty, and unquestioning obedience to authority. They wanted to create people who wouldn't just follow Nazi ideology because they were forced to, but because it would become the only way they knew how to understand the world. Consider the experience of Kurt Klein, who later emigrated from Germany and provided testimony about how Nazi policies affected his daily school life. Kurt watched as his teachers transformed almost overnight from educators into propagandists. Subjects that had once been straightforward became vehicles for ideological indoctrination. In history class, teachers explained how Germany had been betrayed in World War I and how German blood was superior to other races. In biology, students learned to classify human beings into racial hierarchies, with Germans at the top and Jews at the bottom. But it was the little changes that were often most unsettling. Teachers who had once encouraged questions and critical thinking suddenly demanded absolute conformity. Classroom discussions became exercises in repeating approved talking points rather than genuine intellectual exploration. Students learned that there were correct opinions and incorrect opinions, and that expressing the wrong view could have serious consequences for their academic future. Ellen Carey Davis, a Jewish student, described how her family's friendships were systematically destroyed by Nazi school policies. Former friends began to avoid her as teachers explained that associating with Jewish children was inappropriate for loyal Germans. Teachers who had once treated her as a promising student suddenly became cold and distant. She watched classmates she had known for years absorb and repeat anti-Semitic lessons about Jewish character and behavior, often while looking directly at her. The textbooks themselves became instruments of indoctrination. Mathematics problems might ask students to calculate how much money the German state supposedly wasted on caring for disabled people, or how many houses could be built with the resources currently spent on maintaining mental hospitals. German literature classes focused exclusively on authors who promoted themes of racial purity, national sacrifice, and loyalty to the Führer. Science classes taught that racial differences weren't just cultural or superficial, but represented fundamental biological distinctions that determined intelligence, character, and social value. Perhaps most disturbing were the new teacher training programs. Young people entering the education profession were required to attend special courses on racial science and Nazi ideology. They learned techniques for identifying and managing Jewish students, methods for incorporating political messages into academic subjects, and strategies for detecting and reporting families who might harbor anti-Nazi sentiments. Teaching became a form of intelligence gathering, with educators expected to monitor not just their students' academic progress, but their ideological compliance and family backgrounds. The classroom environment itself was transformed. Portraits of Hitler appeared in every room, and students were required to begin each day with Nazi salutes and pledges. Morning announcements included updates on military victories, explanations of new racial laws, and reminders about proper German behavior. Even seemingly innocent school activities like field trips became opportunities for ideological reinforcement. Students might visit Nazi party headquarters, attend political rallies, or tour facilities that demonstrated German technological superiority. Students who resisted these changes faced increasingly severe consequences. Those who refused to participate in Nazi rituals were assigned essays with titles like, "Why am I not in the Hitler Youth?" They faced taunts from teachers and classmates, social isolation, and academic penalties that could prevent them from advancing to higher education. Some were physically attacked by classmates who had internalized lessons about the necessity of enforcing ideological conformity. The most tragic cases involved children from families who opposed Nazi ideology but felt powerless to protect their children from indoctrination. Johannes Fest, a German parent who privately opposed the regime, tried to shield his children from Nazi influence while maintaining the appearance of compliance. He had to find ways to contradict his children's school lessons without putting the family at risk of investigation or arrest. Other parents watched helplessly as their children came home spouting ideology that contradicted everything the family believed, creating painful divisions within households that had once been united. Teachers themselves often struggled with impossible choices. Those who maintained private doubts about Nazi ideology had to choose between their professional survival and their moral convictions. Some found subtle ways to resist, emphasizing academic subjects over political indoctrination or providing alternative perspectives in careful, coded language. Others threw themselves enthusiastically into the new system, either from genuine conviction or from fear of the consequences of insufficient loyalty. The speed and completeness of the transformation was breathtaking. Within just a few years, the Nazis had successfully converted German schools from institutions focused on learning and intellectual development into factories for producing ideologically compliant citizens. They demonstrated that education could be weaponized with terrifying effectiveness, and that young minds could be systematically shaped to accept and promote even the most extreme ideologies. This wasn't an isolated phenomenon limited to Germany, and it wasn't a spontaneous development that emerged organically from German culture. The systematic transformation of education for political purposes followed patterns that had been observed in other totalitarian movements and would be repeated in different contexts throughout the 20th century. The Nazis were simply particularly efficient and thorough in their implementation. The pattern always begins with removing ideological opponents from positions of influence. Jewish teachers were the first to go, but they were followed by anyone who had expressed democratic, socialist, or liberal views. The goal was to eliminate alternative perspectives and ensure that students encountered only approved viewpoints during their educational experience. Next comes the recruitment and training of compliant educators. The National Socialist Teachers League wasn't just a professional organization. It was a mechanism for ideological screening and indoctrination. Teachers who wanted to keep their jobs had to demonstrate not just competence in their subjects, but enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. They attended training sessions on racial science, participated in Nazi party activities, and learned to integrate political messages into their lesson plans. The transformation of curricula and materials followed predictable patterns as well. Traditional academic subjects were maintained but recontextualized to serve political purposes. Science became a tool for justifying racial hierarchies. History became a narrative of German victimhood and racial destiny. literature and arts education, focused exclusively on works that promoted approved themes. Even physical education was reconceptualized as preparation for military service and racial improvement. Perhaps most importantly, the Nazis understood that controlling information wasn't enough. They had to change how students processed information. Critical thinking skills were systematically discouraged in favor of memorization and repetition of approved facts. Students learned to accept authority without question, to view the world in terms of clear distinctions between friends and enemies, and to subordinate individual judgment to collective ideology. This pattern wasn't unique to Nazi Germany. Similar transformations occurred in Soviet schools, where education was reorganized around communist ideology and class struggle. It happened in Maoist China, where students were taught to view the world through the lens of revolutionary struggle and peasant wisdom. It occurred in various forms in other authoritarian societies throughout the 20th century. What made the Nazi version particularly effective was their understanding of adolescent psychology. They recognized that teenagers are naturally idealistic, eager to belong to something larger than themselves, and susceptible to messages that make them feel special and important. The Nazi education system was designed to exploit these tendencies while systematically undermining the development of independent judgment and moral reasoning. The results were predictable and devastating. Within a generation, German schools had produced millions of young people who viewed racial hierarchy as scientific fact, who saw aggressive war as national destiny, and who regarded unquestioning obedience to authority as the highest virtue. They had successfully transformed education from a force for enlightenment into an instrument of indoctrination. The effects of this educational transformation rippled through German society in ways that are still difficult to fully comprehend. By the late 1930s, an entire generation of German children had received their primary education in schools designed to promote Nazi ideology. They graduated with fundamentally different ways of understanding the world than their parents or grandparents, and these differences would shape German society for decades to come. The immediate beneficiaries were the Nazi Party and its supporters, who suddenly had access to millions of young people who had been systematically trained to serve the regime's goals. Students who excelled in the new system often became leaders in Hitler Youth organizations, party officials, or military officers. They formed the backbone of Nazi expansion into occupied territories and the implementation of genocidal policies. Many genuinely believed they were serving humanity by promoting racial purity and German dominance, but the costs were staggering. Jewish children found themselves completely excluded from educational opportunities, as they were first segregated into separate schools and then banned from education entirely. Families with Jewish members watched as their children's academic dreams were systematically destroyed, regardless of their talent, dedication, or previous achievements. Thousands of Jewish families emigrated, specifically to ensure their children could receive education elsewhere. Non-Jewish students who came from families opposed to Nazi ideology faced impossible choices. They could conform to school requirements and contradict their family's values, or they could resist and face academic and social consequences that would limit their future opportunities. Many families developed elaborate strategies for maintaining private beliefs while publicly conforming to avoid detection. The long-term consequences were even more severe. A generation of Germans came of age without learning critical thinking, skills, moral reasoning, or the intellectual tools necessary for democratic citizenship. They had been systematically trained to accept authority without question, to view the world in terms of racial categories, and to subordinate individual conscience to collective ideology. When the Nazi regime collapsed in 1945, German society faced the enormous challenge of re-educating an entire generation that had been indoctrinated from childhood. The international community also suffered from the Nazi educational experiment. German students who had been trained in racial science and nationalist ideology became the administrators of occupied territories, the architects of genocidal policies, and the leaders of aggressive military campaigns. The knowledge and skills they had acquired were deployed in service of conquering and subjugating other nations, making the Nazi educational system a weapon of international aggression as well as domestic control. Perhaps most tragically, many of the students who received Nazi education were themselves victims of the system that claimed to serve their interests. Boys who had been trained from childhood to view war as glorious found themselves dying in brutal conflicts across Europe. Girls who had been taught that their highest purpose was motherhood watched their husbands and sons disappear into military campaigns. The Nazi promise of German racial superiority led directly to national destruction and moral catastrophe. Yet, even as German schools were being transformed into factories for Nazi ideology, and as millions of children were being systematically indoctrinated into racial hatred and unquestioning obedience, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the private lives of German teenagers. Because beyond the public displays of conformity, beyond the mandatory salutes and ideological lessons, young people were still trying to figure out how to navigate the eternal challenges of adolescence, friendship, romance, identity, and rebellion. The Nazi system promised to control every aspect of young people's lives. But teenagers have always found ways to create spaces for authentic human experience, even under the most oppressive circumstances. Some formed underground resistance groups. Others developed coded ways of expressing dissent through music, fashion, or humor. And many simply tried to maintain some sense of normal teenage life, while avoiding the attention of authorities who viewed any deviation from approved behavior as potential treason. The stories of how individual teenagers navigated this impossible landscape reveal both the crushing power of totalitarian control and the remarkable resilience of human nature. Some were crushed by the system, others were corrupted by it, and a few managed to maintain their integrity despite enormous pressure to conform. These personal dramas played out against the backdrop of an increasingly militant society that was preparing for total war, making the stakes of teenage rebellion literally a matter of life and death. By 1943, the contradictions in Nazi society had reached a breaking point that made normal teenage life virtually impossible. The initial seductive promises of the Hitler Youth adventure, belonging, patriotic purpose, had given way to increasingly desperate demands for total loyalty and sacrifice. Boys as young as 16 were being drafted into military service, while their younger brothers were being trained to serve as last-ditch defenders of the homeland. Meanwhile, girls were being prepared not just for motherhood, but for widowhood, as the regime began acknowledging that an entire generation of German men might not survive the war. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't a matter of getting detention for talking back to a teacher or being grounded for staying out past curfew. Teenagers who expressed doubt about Nazi ideology could find themselves investigated by the Gestapo. Those who refused to participate in mandatory youth activities faced social exile, academic failure, and potential arrest. And young people who were classified as racially or politically undesirable faced deportation, imprisonment, or death at the same time. The facade of normal civilian life was becoming impossible to maintain. Allied bombing campaigns were destroying German cities, creating a daily reality of air raid sirens, destroyed buildings, and civilian casualties. Food rationing meant that even basic nutrition was uncertain. And the governments increasingly frantic propaganda couldn't hide the fact that Germany was losing the war, making all the sacrifices demanded of young people seem increasingly pointless. For German teenagers, this meant that every choice, what to say, what to think, where to go, who to befriend, carried potentially life-altering consequences. Some threw themselves more deeply into Nazi ideology, finding comfort in absolute certainty during uncertain times. Others began to quietly distance themselves from the regime, hoping to avoid notice while protecting their families. And a brave few chose active resistance, knowing that they were risking everything to maintain their humanity in an increasingly inhuman world. The story of what happened to the Edelweiss pirates in Cologne perfectly captures the impossible situation facing teenage resistors in Nazi Germany. These weren't hardened revolutionaries or trained saboteurs. They were mostly working-class kids aged 14 to 18, who had initially just wanted alternatives to the rigid conformity of the Hitler Youth. Their resistance began with small acts of defiance, organizing illegal hiking groups, singing band songs, and socializing with members of the opposite sex in ways that violated Hitler Youth regulations. The Edelweiss pirates got their name from the flower symbols they wore to identify each other, and their activities initially seemed almost innocent. They would meet in secret to listen to American jazz music, which the Nazis had banned as degenerate. They organized camping trips and hiking expeditions that deliberately avoided the military-style discipline of official youth organizations. They spray-painted anti-war graffiti on walls and distributed leaflets that mocked Nazi ideology. But as the war progressed and Nazi control became more desperate and violent, the pirates' resistance activities escalated as well. Some groups began providing assistance to German army deserters, forced laborers, and concentration camp escapees. They gathered intelligence about Nazi activities and shared it with Allied forces. A few groups even engaged in sabotage, cutting telephone lines and damaging transportation infrastructure. The Nazi response was swift and brutal. In the summer of 1944, Heinrich Himmler ordered a crackdown on all youth resistance groups, describing them as a threat to German morale and military effectiveness. Gestapo agents infiltrated Edelweiss pirate groups, arrested suspected members, and subjected them to interrogation and torture, designed to extract information about other resistors. The climax came in November 1944, when Nazi authorities in Cologne decided to make an example of 6 young Edelweiss pirates who had been involved in more serious resistance activities. The group included Bartholomew Schenk, who was just 16 years old, and several other teenagers who had been caught providing assistance to forced laborers and escaped prisoners. What happened next revealed the true face of Nazi brutality toward its own citizens. Without any trial, without legal representation, without even formal charges being filed, all 6 teenagers were taken to a public square in Cologne and hanged. They were executed in front of their neighbors, friends, and family. Members as a warning to other young people who might be tempted to resist Nazi authority. Bartholomew Schenk's last words, according to witnesses, were directed at the Nazi officials overseeing his execution. "You can kill us, but you cannot kill our ideas." The 16-year-old boy faced death with more courage and moral clarity than the adults who had ordered his execution. But his courage couldn't save him from the rope. The public hanging sent shockwaves through German youth culture. Word spread quickly that the government was willing to execute teenagers for crimes as minor as listening to banned music or refusing to participate in Hitler Youth activities. Parents who had previously encouraged their children to maintain some independence from Nazi ideology suddenly became terrified that any form of resistance could result in their children's deaths. The aftermath was equally chilling. Nazi authorities left the bodies hanging for hours as a warning to other potential resistors. They distributed photographs of the executions to youth organizations across Germany, accompanied by lectures about the consequences of disloyalty. Teachers were instructed to discuss the executions in their classrooms, emphasizing that the executed teenagers had brought their fate upon themselves through their refusal to serve the fatherland. But perhaps most tragically, the Nazi propaganda machine went to work rewriting the story of the Edelweiss pirates. Instead of acknowledging that they had executed children for minor acts of resistance, Nazi officials claimed that the pirates had been dangerous criminals involved in serious sabotage and espionage activities. They suggested that the executed teenagers had been corrupted by foreign influences and had betrayed their own people. Some German civilians bought into this narrative, either because they genuinely believed Nazi propaganda or because accepting it was psychologically easier than acknowledging that their government was executing children. Others were horrified by what they had witnessed, but felt powerless to protest without risking their own safety. The executions created a climate of fear that effectively ended. Organized youth resistance in most parts of Germany thought the surviving Edelweiss pirates faced impossible choices. Some went underground, abandoning their families and identities to avoid arrest. Others fled to Allied territory if they could manage to cross enemy lines. Many simply gave up their resistance activities and tried to blend back into mainstream German society, hoping that their previous involvement wouldn't be discovered. The Cologne hangings demonstrated that Nazi Germany had reached a point where the regime was willing to murder its own children rather than tolerate even minor forms of dissent. For German teenagers, this meant that the price of maintaining any form of individual identity or moral independence had become potentially fatal. The message was clear: conform completely or face the ultimate consequences. The response to the Edelweiss pirate executions revealed the moral bankruptcy that had infected German society by 1944. While some civilians were horrified by the sight of teenagers being hanged for acts of resistance that would have been considered minor pranks in peacetime, many others accepted or even supported the executions as necessary wartime measures. Nazi propaganda immediately went to work justifying the killings. Officials claimed that the executed teenagers had been involved in serious sabotage activities that threatened German military operations. They suggested that youth resistance groups were being manipulated by foreign agents and that harsh measures were necessary to protect national security. Some propaganda materials even praised the executions as examples of the regime's determination to protect loyal German youth from the corrupting influence of criminal elements. The Hitler Youth Organization used the executions as a recruiting and indoctrination tool. Local leaders organized special meetings where they showed photographs of the executed pirates and explained that this was what happened to young people who refused to serve the fatherland. They emphasized that membership in official Nazi youth organizations provided protection from the dangerous influences that had supposedly corrupted the pirates. Parents across Germany reacted with terror and confusion. Many who had previously encouraged their children to maintain some independence from Nazi ideology suddenly became desperate to ensure their families' conformity with official requirements. Mothers who had once quietly supported their children's resistance to Hitler Youth activities now begged them to participate enthusiastically to avoid suspicion. The educational system also adapted quickly to use the executions as a teaching tool. Teachers incorporated discussions of the Edelweiss pirates into their lessons about loyalty, patriotism, and the dangers of foreign corruption. Students were required to write essays analyzing why the executed teenagers had made wrong choices and explaining how loyal German youth should behave instead. Underground resistance networks that had previously focused on anti-Nazi activities now had to spend enormous resources simply trying to protect young people from regime violence. Adult resistors who had once been willing to involve teenagers in minor activities became terrified that any association with youth could result in death sentences for children. This effectively destroyed most connections between organized resistance movements and potential young recruits. The psychological impact on surviving German teenagers was devastating. Young people who had maintained private doubts about Nazi ideology now faced the knowledge that expressing those doubts could result in execution. The space for individual thought and moral development that had previously existed, however tenuously, was essentially eliminated. International observers who learned about the executions were shocked by the regime's willingness to murder its own children. Allied propaganda used the Cologne hangings as evidence of Nazi brutality and moral corruption, arguing that any government willing to execute teenagers for minor acts of resistance had forfeited any claim to legitimacy. Perhaps most tragically, the executions achieved their intended purpose. Youth resistance activities declined dramatically across Germany as young people realized that the consequences of defiance could be fatal. The few remaining resistance groups became much more secretive and cautious, limiting their activities to avoid detection. Many simply dissolved entirely as members decided that the risks were too great to continue. The Edelweiss pirate executions marked a turning point in Nazi Germany's relationship with its own youth. The regime had demonstrated that it valued ideological conformity more than the lives of its own children, and that it was willing to use the most extreme violence to enforce that conformity. For German teenagers, this meant that the last vestiges of normal adolescent life, the ability to question authority, to form independent friendships, to explore alternative ideas, had been eliminated at gunpoint. The execution of the Edelweiss pirates wasn't just a tragic incident involving a few teenage resistors. It was a symptom of the complete moral collapse that Nazi ideology inevitably produced. When a society reaches the point where it executes children for listening to banned music and questioning official propaganda, it has abandoned any pretense of serving human welfare or protecting future generations. The hangings revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Nazi youth policy. The regime claimed to be building a glorious future for German children, while simultaneously demonstrating its willingness to murder those same children if they failed to conform to official requirements. Nazi propaganda about protecting and nurturing German youth was exposed as a lie when the government showed that it valued ideological purity more than young lives. This event also demonstrated how totalitarian systems inevitably escalate their use of violence over time. What had begun as social pressure and academic penalties for nonconformity had evolved into surveillance, imprisonment, and finally execution. The logic of totalitarian control requires ever-increasing levels of coercion because human nature naturally resists complete domination. For historians studying this period, the Edelweiss pirate executions provide crucial evidence about how Nazi Germany had transformed from a society with serious problems into something approaching pure evil. The willingness to murder children for minor acts of resistance shows that Nazi ideology had become completely disconnected from any recognizable human values. The international implications were equally significant. When news of the executions reached Allied countries, it provided powerful evidence that Nazi Germany had become a regime that posed a fundamental threat to human civilization. The image of teenagers being hanged for listening to jazz music became a symbol of Nazi brutality that helped justify continued Allied resistance even when the war's outcome remained uncertain. Perhaps most importantly, the Cologne hangings demonstrated that resistance to totalitarian control always requires enormous courage and often demands the ultimate sacrifice. The Edelweiss pirates who died in 1944 showed that even under the most oppressive circumstances, some young people will choose to maintain their humanity rather than submit to dehumanizing ideology, regardless of the personal cost. Around the main narratives of indoctrination and resistance, countless other young people played crucial roles that revealed the full complexity of teenage life under Nazi rule. Take Charlotte Wachter, wife of Otto Wachter, a high-ranking Nazi official who governed occupied territories. Her diary entries provide a chilling window into how Nazi families experienced the war, not as victims or resistors, but as enthusiastic participants who genuinely believed they were creating a better world. Charlotte's diary reads like the social calendar of a woman, completely detached from the reality of Nazi crimes happening around her. While her husband was implementing policies that led to mass deportations and executions, Charlotte was writing about attending opera premieres, going hiking with the children, and redecorating their residence with furniture looted from Jewish families. On November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, when Jewish businesses and synagogues were being destroyed across Germany, Charlotte attended a play premiere and then went bar hopping. She made no mention of the violence happening in the streets outside. Her entries reveal someone who had completely compartmentalized her life, focusing on personal pleasures while remaining willfully ignorant of the atrocities her family was helping to commit. When her husband wrote to her about having to execute Polish civilians, she responded with concerns about getting tennis court powder. When Jews were being deported from their city to extermination camps, she was planning social events and shopping expeditions. On the opposite end of the spectrum was Hans Schall, a former Hitler Youth member who became a leader of the White Rose resistance movement. Hans initially embraced Nazi ideology with the enthusiasm typical of many German teenagers, but his experience in the Hitler Youth gradually opened his eyes to the regime's true nature. He began questioning Nazi racial theories, reading banned books, and forming friendships with people whom Nazi ideology classified as enemies. Hans represented thousands of young Germans who underwent a painful process of disillusionment as they matured and gained broader perspective on what their government was actually doing. His transformation from enthusiastic Nazi supporter to active resistor shows how the regime's own education and youth programs sometimes backfired by exposing young people to ideas and experiences that contradicted official propaganda. Then there was Ellen Carey Davis, a Jewish teenager who watched her childhood friendships evaporate as Nazi policies took effect. Ellen's story illustrates the particular cruelty that Nazi Germany inflicted on young people who were classified as racial enemies. She described watching former friends cross the street to avoid her, seeing teachers who had once encouraged her academic ambitions become cold and distant, and gradually understanding that the society she had grown up in no longer considered her human. Ellen's experience was representative of thousands of Jewish teenagers who faced not just physical danger, but the psychological trauma of social rejection by people they had trusted. These young people had to navigate the normal challenges of adolescence while dealing with systematic exclusion, increasing restrictions on their daily activities, and the knowledge that their future, if they had one, lay outside Germany. Alphonse Heck provides yet another perspective, that of a German teenager who fully embraced Nazi ideology and later struggled to understand how he had been so completely deceived. Heck joined the Jungvolk at age 10 and rose through the ranks of Hitler Youth organizations, eventually becoming a regional leader responsible for thousands of other young people. He genuinely believed that he was serving a righteous cause and preparing for a glorious future. Heck's post-war reflections reveal the psychological complexity of Nazi indoctrination. He described the intoxicating feeling of belonging to something larger than himself, the pride he felt in his leadership positions, and the genuine friendships he formed with other Hitler Youth members. But he also struggled with the knowledge that his enthusiasm and leadership had helped prepare other young people for military service in an aggressive war and participation in genocidal policies. His story demonstrates how Nazi youth programs were successful precisely because they provided real benefits: friendship, purpose, leadership training, physical challenges, while gradually introducing ideological elements that led participants toward evil ends. Heck spent decades after the war trying to understand how he and millions of other German young people had been manipulated into supporting atrocity while believing they were serving noble causes. These weren't isolated incidents occurring in separate bubbles. They were interconnected stories that revealed a complex web of relationships, choices, and consequences that defined Nazi Germany. The social networks that connected German teenagers created pathways through which ideology, resistance, and collaboration spread in unpredictable ways. Consider how Charlotte Wachter's privileged position as a Nazi official's wife was directly connected to Ellen Carey Davis's experience of exclusion and persecution. The furniture that Charlotte admired in her redecorated home had been stolen from Jewish families like Ellen's. The social events that Charlotte attended were made possible by policies that excluded Jewish families from German society. Charlotte's comfortable lifestyle was built on the systematic theft and deportation that destroyed Ellen's world. The political networks that Hans Schall developed through his resistance activities connected him to other disillusioned former Hitler youth members, creating chains of communication that spread anti-Nazi ideas throughout German society. But these same networks made all participants vulnerable to discovery and arrest, since the capture of any one member could lead authorities to dozens of others. Alphonse Heck's position as a Hitler Youth leader meant that his enthusiasm and effectiveness directly influenced hundreds of other young people who looked up to him as a role model. His success in Nazi youth organizations helped legitimize the system for other teenagers who might have been more skeptical if they had seemed less effective. Leadership. The friendships and loyalty he inspired among his subordinates made them more willing to accept increasingly extreme demands from the regime. The geographic networks were equally important. Young people in different regions of Germany had vastly different experiences depending on local leadership, economic conditions, and proximity to military action. Teenagers in Berlin, like Brigitte Eick, could maintain relative normalcy even as the war intensified, while young people in border regions faced immediate consequences of military occupation and resistance activities. Family networks created additional layers of complexity. Parents who privately opposed Nazi ideology had to decide whether to share their doubts with their children, knowing that children were encouraged to report ideologically unreliable family members to authorities. Some families developed elaborate systems of coded communication that allowed them to maintain private beliefs while publicly conforming to official requirements. The professional networks that connected teachers, youth leaders, and party officials created pathways through which Nazi ideology was refined and implemented. Teachers who showed enthusiasm for new curricula were promoted to positions where they could train other educators. Hitler Youth leaders who demonstrated effectiveness were transferred to regions where resistance was higher. These networks ensured that successful indoctrination techniques spread rapidly throughout the system. Religious networks provided some of the strongest sources of alternative values and resistance to Nazi ideology, but they also created vulnerabilities. Young people from deeply religious families often faced particularly intense conflicts between church teachings and official ideology. Some found ways to compartmentalize these competing belief systems, while others were forced to choose between family loyalty and social acceptance. Economic networks determined which families had resources to protect their children from the worst consequences of Nazi policies. Wealthy families could sometimes afford to send children abroad before conditions became too dangerous. Working-class families often had fewer options and faced more direct pressure to participate in Nazi organizations and activities. The underground networks that connected resistance groups operated across all these other connections, creating secret pathways for communication, resource sharing, and mutual protection. But these networks were also the most dangerous, since discovery could result in death for all participants. Perhaps most importantly, the generational networks that connected young people to their parents and grandparents created ongoing tension between traditional values and Nazi ideology. Older Germans who remembered pre-Nazi society sometimes served as sources of alternative perspective for young people, but they also had to be careful not to expose their families to danger by expressing forbidden ideas too openly. These interconnected networks meant that individual choices had consequences far beyond personal survival. A teenager's decision to resist or collaborate affected not just their own fate, but the safety and opportunities available to everyone connected to them through family, friendship, political, religious, or economic relationships. To understand why Nazi ideology was so seductive for many German teenagers, you have to understand the broader cultural context that made their promises seem believable and attractive. Germany in the 1930s was a society recovering from national humiliation, economic depression, and political chaos. Many families had experienced severe hardship during the post-World War I years, and traditional institutions like churches, schools, and governments had lost much of their credibility. For young people coming of age during this period, Nazi organizations offered something that mainstream society had failed to provide: clear purpose, definite answers, and the promise of personal significance in a great historical mission. The Hitler Youth didn't just provide activities and social connections, it offered a complete worldview. That explained why Germany had suffered and how young people could help restore their nation's greatness. Daily life in Nazi Germany was structured around rituals and symbols that reinforced ideological messages at every turn. Students began each school day with Nazi salutes and patriotic songs. Public buildings displayed Nazi flags and portraits of Hitler. Radio broadcasts included constant updates on military victories and explanations of Nazi policies. Even entertainment was designed to promote approved messages about racial purity, national loyalty, and personal sacrifice. The cultural emphasis on physical fitness and outdoor activities appealed particularly strongly to young people who had grown up during years of economic hardship and social restrictions. Hitler Youth camping trips, sports competitions, and hiking expeditions offered genuine fun and adventure that many teenagers had never experienced before. The military-style uniforms and ceremonies made participants feel important and mature in ways that regular civilian life didn't provide. But the Nazi cultural program also systematically undermined values that might have provided alternatives to official ideology. Traditional religious teachings about universal human dignity were replaced with racial theories that divided humanity into superior and inferior categories. Classical education that emphasized critical thinking and moral reasoning was replaced with curricula focused on memorization and ideological conformity. Art and literature that explored complex human experiences were replaced with propaganda that promoted simple, black and white thinking. Perhaps most insidiously, Nazi culture redefined normal human emotions and relationships in ways that served political purposes. Love became loyalty to the Volk. Compassion became concern for racial purity. Courage became willingness to sacrifice for the Führer. Justice became punishment of racial enemies. These redefinitions made it psychologically easier for ordinary young people to participate in or ignore atrocities, since they could convince themselves that they were serving higher moral purposes. The speed of cultural change was particularly disorienting for young people who had to navigate shifting social norms while dealing with normal adolescent development. Behaviors that had been considered virtuous, questioning authority, showing compassion for outsiders, maintaining friendships across social boundaries, suddenly became dangerous. Meanwhile, attitudes that had previously been considered antisocial, aggressive nationalism, racial prejudice, unquestioning obedience, were now officially promoted as civic virtues. This cultural transformation created a generation gap that was often unbridgeable, as young people absorbed Nazi values while their parents maintained pre-Nazi perspectives. Family dinners became potential sites of political conflict, and many households developed unspoken agreements to avoid discussing anything that might reveal ideological differences. Perhaps most ironic was how the Nazi promised to create a glorious future for German youth led directly to the systematic destruction of an entire generation. Boys who had been told they were the master race found themselves dying in brutal conflicts across Europe. Girls who had been promised honored roles as mothers of the new Germany watched their husbands and sons disappear into military campaigns that consumed millions of lives. The Hitler Youth's emphasis on physical fitness and outdoor adventure was designed to prepare young people for healthy, productive lives, but it actually served as training for aggressive war and genocide. The camping trips and hiking expeditions that provided genuine enjoyment were also preparation for military campaigns in hostile territory. The sports competitions that built friendships and teamwork were also training for combat situations, where those same skills would be used to kill other human beings. Nazi educational reforms that promised to make German children stronger and more capable actually weakened German society by eliminating critical thinking, moral reasoning, and scientific objectivity. The racial science courses that were supposed to demonstrate German superiority were based on pseudoscientific nonsense that undermined genuine scientific education. The history classes that emphasized German victimhood and racial destiny ignored the complex realities that young people needed to understand to navigate the modern world. The Nazi youth organizations that claimed to build character and leadership actually trained young people to suppress individual conscience in favor of group conformity. The loyalty and obedience that were supposedly virtuous qualities became tools for implementing policies that contradicted basic human decency. Perhaps most tragically, many of the positive experiences that German teenagers genuinely had in Nazi organizations, the friendships, the sense of purpose, the opportunities for leadership and adventure were made possible by a system that was simultaneously preparing them to participate in or tolerate genocide. The same camps where teenagers formed lifelong friendships were also sites of ideological indoctrination that prepared participants to view other human beings as subhuman enemies, young people who thought they were serving their country and protecting their families were actually enabling policies that would lead to national destruction and moral catastrophe. The very success of Nazi youth programs in providing positive experiences for participants made them more effective tools for implementing evil policies. Everything changed when the Nazi regime stopped pretending that German teenagers were being prepared for a peaceful future and began openly treating them as military resources to be consumed in total war. The turning point came gradually, that first, then with devastating speed, as Germany's military situation became increasingly desperate. What had been presented as character-building activities and patriotic education suddenly revealed its true purpose, training child soldiers for a war that was consuming the entire male population of Germany. The shift became undeniable in 1943, when all boys aged 17 and older were forced into military service. This wasn't voluntary enlistment or even traditional conscription. It was the systematic militarization of childhood itself. Teenagers who had been playing war games in Hitler Youth organizations suddenly found themselves in actual combat situations, facing experienced Allied soldiers with minimal training and inadequate equipment. But even that was just the beginning. As Germany's military position deteriorated through 1944 and 1945, the regime began reaching deeper into its population of children. Boys as young as 16 were drafted into military service. Then 15-year-olds. Then 14-year-olds. By the final months of the war, The Nazi leadership was pulling children out of elementary schools and sending them to defend German cities against advancing Allied armies. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the practical one. Hitler Youth activities that had once emphasized hiking, camping, and community service were replaced with increasingly serious military training. Boys learned to operate anti-aircraft guns, participated in defensive fortification projects, and received instruction in urban combat techniques. The gap between childhood games and adult warfare effectively disappeared. For families who had previously supported their children's participation in Nazi youth organizations, this militarization created impossible dilemmas. Parents who had been proud of their son's advancement through Hitler youth ranks suddenly faced the prospect of watching children march off to die in hopeless military campaigns. The regime that had promised to protect and nurture German youth was now openly sacrificing those same children to postpone military defeat. The speed of this transformation revealed how completely Nazi ideology had always prioritized political goals over human welfare. The same leaders who had spent years claiming that everything they did was for the benefit of German children now demanded that those children die to protect the regime that had betrayed them. The youth organizations that had been presented as beneficial social programs were exposed as recruitment and training systems for military service. The broader German population began to understand that their government viewed young people not as future citizens to be protected and educated, but as military resources to be deployed and consumed as needed. The Nazi promise of a 1,000-year Reich was being paid for with the lives of the generation that was supposed to inherit it. And for German teenagers, this meant that the last vestiges of normal adolescent life, the possibility of planning for the future, of dreaming about careers and families, of believing that they would survive to adulthood, were being systematically destroyed by the very system that claimed to serve their interests. The transformation from youth organization to military recruitment system didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that made each step seem logical and necessary, while obscuring the ultimate destination. The Nazi leadership was skilled at implementing incremental changes that prepared German society to accept increasingly extreme demands without triggering massive resistance. Initially, the militarization was disguised as enhanced physical fitness and outdoor education programs. Hitler Youth activities began to include more military-style exercises, but these were presented as exciting challenges that would build character and prepare young people for leadership roles in the new Germany. Boys learned marching drills, but they were told this was about discipline and teamwork. They practiced with weapons, but this was described as outdoor recreation, similar to hunting or sport shooting. The resistance to these changes was fragmented and often ineffective because they were implemented gradually and because opposing voices had already been eliminated from positions of influence. Parents who might have objected to their children receiving military training were told that these activities were voluntary and educational. Teachers who had doubts about the new curricula had already been replaced or intimidated into compliance. Religious leaders who might have provided moral opposition had been marginalized or co-opted. As the war began in 1939, the military elements of Hitler Youth training became more explicit and intensive. Boys were taught to operate military equipment, participate in civil defense activities, and assist with wartime logistics. But these activities were still presented as supporting the war effort rather than preparing for direct combat participation. The champions of this militarization were often the teenagers themselves, who had been successfully indoctrinated to view military service as the highest form of patriotic duty. Young people who had spent years absorbing Nazi ideology about German racial superiority and national destiny genuinely believed that they were being called to participate in a historic mission to secure their nation's future. They volunteered for increasingly dangerous assignments and encouraged their peers to demonstrate similar commitment. The breakthrough moments came as Germany's military situation deteriorated and the regime abandoned any pretense that children would be protected from combat. In 1943, the formation of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, marked the first systematic deployment of Hitler Youth members in regular military units. This division, composed primarily of 17-year-old volunteers, was sent to defend France against the Allied invasion and quickly gained a reputation for fanatical resistance and extreme violence. The success of the Hitlerjugend division in military operations convinced Nazi leadership that German teenagers could serve effectively as regular soldiers, leading to the systematic lowering of recruitment ages and the elimination of protections that had previously shielded children from combat service. What had started as character-building exercises had become literal preparation for death in battle. The obstacles encountered during this transformation revealed the limits of Nazi control over German society. Some parents refused to allow their younger children to participate in increasingly militarized activities, leading to conflicts with local authorities. Some teachers resisted efforts to convert classroom instruction into military preparation. Some Hitler Youth leaders themselves began to question whether they were serving the best interests of the young people under their supervision. But these individual acts of resistance were overwhelmed by the momentum of institutional change and social pressure. Families who tried to protect their children from militarization found themselves isolated and vulnerable to official retaliation. Educators who maintained focus on academic rather than military instruction were transferred or dismissed. Youth leaders who expressed concerns about the safety and welfare of their members were replaced with more compliant officials. The role of larger historical forces became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Germany's deteriorating military situation created pressures that overwhelmed individual choice and institutional resistance. The logic of total war demanded the mobilization of every available resource, including children. Nazi ideology provided justification for sacrificing young lives in service of political goals. But the immediate cause was military necessity rather than ideological preference. The new system was a complete perversion of everything that youth organizations are supposed to represent. Instead of protecting children and preparing them for productive adult lives, the militarized Hitler Youth was systematically feeding young people into a war machine that consumed them as rapidly as it could produce them. By 1945, the average age of German soldiers defending Berlin had dropped to barely 16 years old, with some units composed primarily of 14 and 15-year-old boys who had been pulled directly from their classrooms. The new rules were brutal and unforgiving. Children who would have been considered too young to vote, drive, or marry were now expected to operate complex military equipment, make life-and-death tactical decisions, and engage experienced enemy soldiers in combat. The same boys who had been participating in hiking expeditions and camping trips just months earlier were now manning anti-aircraft guns during Allied bombing raids and serving in defensive positions during urban warfare. The norms of childhood and adolescence were completely abandoned in favor of military priorities. Teenagers were no longer protected from violence. They were expected to participate in it. They were no longer shielded from adult responsibilities. They were given responsibilities that most adults would find overwhelming. The educational system that was supposed to prepare them for the future was converted into immediate military training for conflicts they were unlikely to survive. What stayed the same was the rhetoric and symbolism that had always surrounded Nazi youth organizations. Leaders continued to speak about honor, duty, and service to the fatherland. The uniforms, songs, and ceremonies remained largely unchanged. The social pressure to demonstrate loyalty and courage was as intense as ever. But these familiar elements now concealed a reality that was completely different from what had been promised. The most tragic aspect of this new reality was how many German teenagers embraced it willingly, having been successfully conditioned to view military sacrifice as the highest expression of their worth as Germans. Boys, who should have been worrying about school exams and first dates, were instead volunteering for increasingly dangerous military assignments, genuinely believing that they were serving noble purposes. Girls in the League of German girls faced a different, but equally distorted reality. Instead of being prepared for normal family life, they were being trained to become widows and single mothers in a society where most young men would not survive the war. Their domestic education shifted from childcare and homemaking to managing households during wartime emergencies, caring for wounded soldiers, and maintaining morale in a collapsing society. The administrative structures that managed this system had become completely disconnected from any recognizable understanding of child welfare or educational development. Local Hitler youth leaders were now essentially military recruiters whose primary responsibility was identifying and training new soldiers. Teachers had become drill instructors and propaganda specialists. Parents had become support staff for a system that treated their children as expendable. Military resources. The new reality also meant that normal teenage concerns and activities, friendships, romance, academic achievement, career planning, were now considered selfish distractions from military duty. Young people who expressed interest in non-military pursuits were viewed as insufficiently committed to the national struggle. The space for individual development and personal choice that had been steadily shrinking since 1933 now disappeared entirely. Perhaps most chilling was how quickly German society adapted to this new normal. Communities that had once celebrated their young people's academic achievements now honored them for military service. Families that had once planned for their children's educational and professional futures now focused on preparing them for war and potential death. The complete militarization of childhood became accepted as necessary and even admirable, rather than as the horrific perversion of human development that it actually represented. Was this transformation positive or negative? The question seems almost absurd given what we know about the consequences. But it's important to understand that many Germans at the time viewed the militarization of their youth as necessary and even beneficial. Nazi propaganda presented the change as evidence of German determination and national unity. Supporters argued that difficult times required extraordinary sacrifices and that young Germans were demonstrating admirable courage by accepting military responsibilities. From a short-term perspective, the militarization did achieve some of its immediate goals. German teenagers proved to be effective soldiers who fought with fanatical determination against overwhelming odds. The Hitler-Jugend Division and other youth units delayed Allied advances and inflicted significant casualties on enemy forces. For military commanders desperate for manpower, the recruitment of teenagers provided essential reinforcements during the final phases of the war. But the long-term effects were catastrophic beyond measure. An entire generation of German young people was decimated by military campaigns that served no rational purpose beyond postponing inevitable defeat. Hundreds of thousands of teenagers who should have become the foundation of post-war German society instead died in hopeless defensive battles or were permanently disabled by combat trauma. The psychological damage was equally severe. Young people who survived their military service had been systematically trained to suppress empathy, critical thinking, and moral reasoning in favor of absolute obedience and ideological conformity. The process of rebuilding German society after 1945 was enormously complicated by the need to re-educate a generation that had been thoroughly indoctrinated in totalitarian values. Modern judgment is clear that the militarization of German youth represented one of the most serious crimes committed by the Nazi regime. Contemporary international law recognizes the recruitment of child soldiers as a war crime, and the systematic militarization of an entire generation's children violates every principle of human rights and child welfare that civilized societies have developed. The Nazi experiment with militarized youth also demonstrated the vulnerability of young people to ideological manipulation when adult institutions failed to protect them. The teenagers who enthusiastically embraced military service were not inherently evil. They were children who had been systematically deceived and exploited by adults, who should have been protecting their welfare and development. In the final years and months of the war, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from all directions, the Nazi system's treatment of young people reached levels of desperation and cruelty that defied rational explanation. The regime that had promised to create a glorious future for German youth was now literally consuming children to postpone its own inevitable collapse. By 1945, the Volksturm, supposedly Germany's last line of defense, was commonly drafting 12-year-old boys directly from their elementary school classrooms. The aftermath of the militarization was immediate and devastating. German cities were defended by children who had been given weapons they barely knew how to use and told to fight to the death against experienced Allied soldiers. The Battle of Berlin, which marked the final collapse of Nazi Germany, was fought largely by teenagers who had been recruited from Hitler Youth organizations and thrown into combat with minimal training and no realistic hope of survival. These child soldiers fought with a fanaticism that horrified Allied forces, who found themselves in the surreal position of having to kill children in order to advance toward German government centers. The indoctrination had been so complete that many German teenagers preferred death to surrender, having been convinced that capture by Allied forces would result in torture and execution. The psychological aftermath was equally severe. German teenagers who survived the final battles had been traumatized not just by combat experience, but by the realization that the adults they had trusted had systematically betrayed them. The leaders who had promised protection and guidance had instead sent children to die in hopeless military campaigns. The ideology that had provided meaning and purpose was revealed to be a collection of lies designed to manipulate young people into serving evil ends. For families who had lost children to the militarization, the aftermath brought not just grief, but a terrible understanding of how completely they had been deceived. Parents who had been proud of their son's advancement through Hitler youth ranks now faced the knowledge that those same organizations had systematically prepared their children for death. The community celebrations and patriotic ceremonies that had once seemed meaningful were revealed to have been elaborate rituals designed to facilitate child sacrifice. The broader German society also had to confront the moral implications of what they had allowed to happen to their young people. Communities that had supported the militarization of youth organizations now faced the reality that they had participated in the systematic destruction of an entire generation. The teachers, youth leaders, and local officials who had implemented Nazi policies had to reckon with their role in preparing children for military service that served no legitimate defensive purpose. New challenges emerged immediately as Allied occupation forces struggled to deal with the psychological and social consequences of Nazi youth indoctrination. Many German teenagers had been so thoroughly conditioned to view Allied soldiers as subhuman enemies that they continued to resist occupation policies, even after the formal end of hostilities. The process of denazification required not just political changes, but comprehensive psychological rehabilitation for young people who had been systematically trained to suppress critical thinking and moral reasoning. As Nazi Germany collapsed, new institutions and individuals emerged to deal with the impoverished wreckage of what had been done to German youth. Allied occupation forces found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to rehabilitate an entire generation of children who had been systematically indoctrinated into totalitarian ideology and trained for military service from early childhood. The Allied Control Council, which governed occupied Germany, immediately disbanded all Nazi youth organizations and began the enormous task of creating alternative institutions that could provide positive social experiences for young people without the ideological manipulation that had characterized Hitler Youth programs. This was far more complicated than simply banning Nazi organizations. It required rebuilding the entire infrastructure of youth development from scratch. American, British, French, and Soviet occupation authorities each brought different approaches to the challenge of re-educating German youth. The Americans emphasized democratic participation and individual responsibility. The British focused on rebuilding traditional educational institutions and civic organizations. The French promoted cultural exchange and intellectual development. The Soviets implemented their own version of collectivist youth programs designed to promote socialist rather than fascist ideology. Religious organizations that had been marginalized or persecuted under Nazi rule emerged as crucial players in providing alternative frameworks for youth development. Catholic and Protestant youth groups that had been forced underground during the Nazi period now worked to reconnect young Germans with moral and spiritual traditions that emphasized individual conscience and universal human dignity rather than racial superiority and national aggression. Educational reformers from both Germany and Allied countries collaborated to develop new curricula and teaching methods that would promote critical thinking, moral reasoning, and democratic citizenship skills. This required not just creating new textbooks and lesson plans, but retraining an entire generation of teachers who had been compelled to serve Nazi ideological goals during the war years. International humanitarian organizations also played important roles in addressing the immediate physical and psychological needs of German youth who had been traumatized by combat experience and ideological indoctrination. Organizations like the International Red Cross and various religious charities worked to provide basic necessities like food, shelter, and medical care, while also offering counseling and support services for young people struggling to understand what had happened to their society. Perhaps most importantly, a new generation of German intellectuals, educators, and political leaders emerged who were committed to ensuring that the catastrophic mistakes of the Nazi period would never be repeated. These individuals, many of whom had themselves been young people during the Nazi era, understood firsthand how vulnerable teenagers could be to ideological manipulation and were determined to create institutions that would protect rather than exploit young people's natural idealism and desire for belonging. The differences between these new players and their Nazi predecessors couldn't have been more stark. While Nazi youth leaders had been selected primarily for ideological reliability and had been trained to suppress independent thinking and moral reasoning, the new youth workers emphasized professional competence, ethical development, and respect for individual dignity. While Nazi educational policies had been designed to serve political purposes, regardless of their impact on individual students, post-war educational reforms prioritized student welfare and development above institutional goals. Their contributions to rebuilding German society were enormous, but they also faced incredible challenges. Many German teenagers remained loyal to Nazi ideology, even after the regime's collapse, having been convinced that military defeat was temporary and that Nazi principles remained valid. Others were completely disillusioned and struggled to find meaning or purpose in a world where everything they had been taught was revealed to be false. The new institutions had to address both resistance and despair while rebuilding social trust that had been systematically destroyed during the Nazi period. But many problems proved remarkably persistent, revealing how deeply Nazi ideology had penetrated German society and how difficult it would be to repair the damage done to an entire generation of young people. The systematic indoctrination that had begun in elementary schools and continued through adolescence had created psychological and social patterns that couldn't be changed simply by banning Nazi organizations and replacing Nazi textbooks. One of the most intractable issues was the continued presence of Nazi sympathizers in positions that influenced young people's development. While the most prominent Nazi leaders were removed from power, many teachers, youth workers, and local officials who had enthusiastically implemented Nazi policies remained in their positions, either because their complicity was overlooked or because replacing them would have left crucial institutions completely unstaffed. These individuals often continued to promote Nazi ideas in subtle ways, even after being officially prohibited from doing so. They might emphasize themes of German victimhood rather than German responsibility for wartime atrocities. They might promote authoritarian rather than democratic approaches to problem solving. They might discourage critical examination of recent German history or encourage students to view Allied occupation as unjust foreign domination rather than as necessary consequences of German aggression. The problem of persistent Nazi ideology was complicated by the fact that many German families had genuinely benefited from Nazi policies and retained positive memories of the pre-war period. Parents who had watched their children advance through Hitler Youth organizations and gain access to educational and professional opportunities often struggled to accept that the system they had supported was fundamentally evil. They might acknowledge that the war had been a mistake while maintaining that Nazi domestic policies had been beneficial. Another ongoing issue was the psychological trauma experienced by young people who had been systematically prepared for military service and ideological conformity, but now faced a completely different set of social expectations. Many German teenagers struggled with profound identity confusion as they tried to understand who they were and what they believed in a world where everything they had been taught was now considered false or harmful. The educational system faced particular challenges in trying to promote critical thinking and moral reasoning among students who had been systematically trained to suppress these capabilities. Teachers found that many students were unable or unwilling to engage in genuine intellectual discussion, having learned that questioning authority or expressing independent opinions was dangerous. Others swung to the opposite extreme, rejecting all forms of authority and guidance as potentially manipulative. Social relationships among young people remained distorted by years of ideological training that had emphasized conformity, hierarchy, and hostility toward designated enemies. Former Hitler Youth members often struggled to form healthy friendships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than shared ideology and institutional loyalty. Many found it difficult to trust peers who came from families with different political backgrounds or who had experienced the war differently. The integration of young people who had been classified as enemies under Nazi racial laws presented additional challenges. Jewish survivors who returned to Germany often found that their former classmates and neighbors retained anti-Semitic attitudes despite official denazification efforts. Other groups that had been persecuted by the Nazi regime faced similar difficulties in reintegrating into communities where many residents had supported or participated in their previous exclusion. Perhaps most troubling was the emergence of cyclical patterns where the children of Nazi supporters passed on modified versions of authoritarian and nationalist ideas to their own children, creating ongoing sources of political extremism that would continue to influence German society for decades. The problem of intergenerational transmission of harmful ideologies proved much more difficult to address than the immediate challenge of removing Nazi leaders from power. Compared to other societies that have experienced systematic indoctrination of youth, Nazi Germany's experiment was both unusually comprehensive and remarkably effective in achieving its immediate goals while creating long-term damage that would take generations to repair. The Soviet Union's communist youth organizations, while also designed to serve political purposes, generally maintained some connection between ideology and genuine educational development. China's Cultural Revolution involved young people in political violence, but typically for shorter periods and with less systematic preparation. What was unique about the Nazi approach was how successfully they combined genuine benefits for participants with gradual indoctrination into increasingly extreme ideology. Many other totalitarian movements relied primarily on fear and coercion to ensure compliance. But the Nazi youth programs actually provided positive experiences that made participants genuinely grateful for their involvement. This made the indoctrination more effective and the subsequent disillusionment more traumatic. The Nazi system was also unusually effective at penetrating family relationships and turning children into surveillance agents within their own households. While other authoritarian regimes have encouraged young people to report on political distance, few have been as successful as the Nazis in making such reporting seem like a moral duty rather than a betrayal of personal relationships. Compared to modern democratic societies, the Nazi experience demonstrates how quickly and completely educational and youth development institutions can be transformed to serve political rather than developmental purposes. The speed with which German teachers, youth leaders, and educational administrators adapted to Nazi requirements shows how vulnerable these institutions can be to political pressure, especially during periods of social and economic stress. The patterns that emerged in Nazi Germany have unfortunately been repeated in various forms in other contexts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Child soldier recruitment in various African conflicts has followed similar patterns of combining ideological indoctrination with military training. Extremist religious movements have used comparable techniques to recruit and radicalize young people. Even democratic societies have seen concerning examples of educational institutions being used to promote partisan political agendas, rather than critical thinking and moral development. The lessons that could be learned from the Nazi experience are both obvious and largely ignored. The most important lesson is that young people's natural idealism and desire for belonging make them particularly vulnerable to manipulation by adults who are willing to exploit these qualities for political purposes. The second lesson is that educational and youth development institutions require active protection from political interference, since they can be transformed into instruments of indoctrination much more easily than they can be restored to their proper developmental functions. The third lesson is that the damage done by systematic indoctrination extends far beyond the immediate victims and continues to influence society for generations after the original perpetrators have been removed from power. The most important safeguard against repetition of such catastrophes is maintaining institutions that promote critical thinking, moral reasoning, and respect for individual dignity as core values that cannot be subordinated to political or ideological goals. By early 1945, even the most fanatical Nazi supporters couldn't ignore the signs that their thousand-year Reich was collapsing around them. The Soviet army was approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine from the west, and German cities were being bombed around the clock by Allied air forces that faced virtually no opposition from the depleted German Air Force. But perhaps the most telling sign of impending collapse was what the Nazi leadership was demanding from its youngest supporters. Key players in the Nazi hierarchy could see the writing on the wall, but they responded to inevitable defeat by making increasingly desperate and irrational demands rather than seeking realistic solutions. Heinrich Himmler was ordering the recruitment of 12-year-old boys into the Volkssturm. Joseph Goebbels was proclaiming that German civilians should choose death rather than surrender. and Hitler himself was issuing orders for the complete destruction of German infrastructure to prevent it from falling into Allied hands, effectively condemning his own people to starvation and chaos. What these leaders missed, or chose to ignore, was that their own supporters were losing faith in the Nazi project. Parents who had once been proud to send their sons to Hitler Youth activities were now hiding their younger children to prevent them from being drafted into military service. Teachers who had enthusiastically promoted Nazi ideology were quietly abandoning political indoctrination in favor of basic survival skills. Even Hitler Youth leaders were beginning to question orders that seemed designed to sacrifice young lives for no achievable military purpose. The resistance to inevitable change took the form of increasingly frantic efforts to maintain ideological control, even as practical control slipped away. Nazi propaganda became more extreme and unrealistic, promising miraculous secret weapons that would reverse German fortunes and claiming that temporary setbacks would lead to ultimate victory. Youth organizations were restructured to focus entirely on military preparation, abandoning any pretense of educational or developmental purposes. Some Nazi officials began making preparations for their own survival, rather than continuing to serve the regime they had supported. Heinrich Himmler attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies, hoping to save himself by betraying Hitler. Other leaders made plans to flee to South America or other countries where they might avoid prosecution for their war crimes. But they continued to demand absolute loyalty and sacrifice from German young people, even as they prepared to abandon the movement they had led. The most tragic aspect of this period was how many German teenagers continued to demonstrate loyalty to leaders who were already planning to betray them. Young people who had been systematically indoctrinated to view Nazi ideology as absolute truth continued to volunteer for hopeless military missions and suicidal defensive operations. They genuinely believed they were serving noble purposes, even as the adults who had shaped their beliefs were already abandoning the movement and preparing for post-war survival. The warning signs were everywhere, but the system that the Nazis had created to control young minds also prevented many teenagers from recognizing or understanding what those signs meant. They had been trained to ignore evidence that contradicted official propaganda and to view doubt or questioning as signs of moral weakness, rather than rational responses to changing circumstances. The end came with shocking speed once the facade of Nazi control finally collapsed. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin while the city above was being defended primarily by teenagers who had been pulled from Hitler Youth organizations and given weapons they barely knew how to use. The man who had promised to create a glorious future for German youth chose death rather than face the consequences of what he had done to an entire generation. The final major players in this tragedy were not the Nazi leaders who had created the system, but the children who had been consumed by it. The last defenders of Berlin included boys as young as 14 who fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds, genuinely believing they were protecting their families and homeland from enemy occupation. Many refused opportunities to surrender, having been convinced that capture would result in torture and execution. Heinrich Himmler, one of the SS officials responsible for recruiting child soldiers, disappeared in the final weeks of the war and was never found. Joseph Goebbels murdered his own children rather than allow them to live in a world without National Socialism, then committed suicide alongside his wife. Heinrich Himmler was captured by Allied forces while attempting to flee in disguise, but took poison rather than face trial for his crimes. The dramatic final moments played out differently across Germany as various regions fell to Allied forces. In some areas, local officials attempted to surrender quietly to protect remaining civilians from pointless battles. In others, Fanatical Nazi loyalists forced children to continue fighting even after all military hope was lost. The Hitler Youth members, who had been trained to view death as preferable to defeat, often fought literally to the last bullet. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of these final battles was watching German teenagers who had been systematically prepared for this moment discover that their sacrifices were meaningless. Boys who had spent years training for glorious combat found themselves engaged in desperate urban warfare against enemies who vastly outnumbered and outgunned them. The camping trips and war games that had seemed so exciting were revealed to have been preparation for hopeless defensive battles in bombed-out cities. The gradual decline of Nazi control had been masked by increasingly frantic propaganda and desperate organizational changes, but the collapse, when it came, was total and immediate. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces, and the Nazi regime that had promised to last for 1,000 years disappeared. Entirely after just 12 years of existence, the symbolic endpoints were as dramatic as they were tragic. The Hitler Youth headquarters in Munich was occupied by American forces who found files documenting the systematic indoctrination and militarization of millions of German children. The Olympic Stadium in Berlin, where Nazi youth had participated in massive rallies celebrating German racial superiority, became a staging area for Allied relief operations. The schools where children had been taught Nazi racial science were converted into centers for democratic re-education. But perhaps the most powerful symbolic moment came when Allied soldiers encountered German child soldiers during the final battles and realized they were fighting against victims rather than enemies. Many Allied veterans later described the shock of discovering that their opponents were children who had been systematically prepared for military service by adults who had already abandoned them to their fate. The last attempts to preserve Nazi influence took the form of efforts by surviving leaders to escape prosecution and continue their work in other countries. Some Nazi officials successfully fled to South America, where they attempted to maintain Nazi organizations and ideology. Among German expatriate communities, others tried to blend into post-war German society, hiding their previous roles while continuing to promote authoritarian and nationalist ideas in subtler forms. But for the millions of German young people who had been shaped by Nazi organizations and ideology, there was no escape from the consequences of what had been done to them. They faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding their lives and their society while coming to terms with the realization that everything they had been taught was false and that the adults they had trusted had systematically betrayed them. The Nazi regime collapsed for reasons that were both external and internal. But the treatment of German youth played a crucial role in both dimensions of the failure. Externally, the decision to use children as soldiers accelerated military defeat by wasting human resources and horrifying international observers who might otherwise have been willing to negotiate a compromise peace. Internally, the systematic betrayal of young people's trust undermined the social foundations that any sustainable political system requires. The internal problems were particularly devastating because they struck at the heart of Nazi claims about serving German national interests, a movement that promised to protect and nurture German children while simultaneously sending them to die in hopeless military campaigns was revealed to be fundamentally hypocritical. Parents who had initially supported Nazi youth programs because they seemed to benefit their children gradually realized that those same programs were designed to prepare their children for sacrifice rather than success. External pressures created impossible demands that exposed the contradictions in Nazi ideology. The regime's commitment to aggressive expansion and racial domination required military resources that Germany simply didn't possess, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to mobilize every available person, including children. The international Response to German aggression made compromise impossible, forcing Nazi leaders to choose between admitting failure and demanding ever greater sacrifices from their own people. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending the Nazi regime is complex and contested. Clearly, the military and political decisions made by Allied leaders were crucial in defeating German forces and occupying German territory. But it's also true that the internal contradictions of Nazi ideology would have led to collapse eventually, even without external military pressure. What could have been done differently depends on which perspective you take. From a German standpoint, the obvious alternative would have been rejecting Nazi ideology entirely and maintaining democratic institutions that protected individual rights and promoted international cooperation. From an international perspective, earlier and more decisive action to oppose Nazi aggression might have prevented the war and saved millions of lives. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly relevant to understanding what happened to German youth. The systematic indoctrination and militarization of children wasn't an accidental byproduct of Nazi policy. It was a central element of Nazi ideology from the beginning. The movement's emphasis on racial superiority and national expansion required the systematic preparation of young people for aggressive war and genocidal policies. At the same time, many of the specific decisions that led to the systematic abuse of German youth were contingent responses to particular circumstances. The lowering of recruitment ages, the formation of child soldier units, and the use of elementary school students in defensive operations were desperate responses to military defeat rather than planned elements of Nazi ideology. The inevitability of failure was built into the contradictions of Nazi ideology itself. A movement that claimed to serve German national interests while systematically destroying German society could not have succeeded in the long term. The abuse of German youth was both a symptom of these contradictions and a factor that accelerated the regime's collapse. But the specific timing and manner of the collapse were influenced by contingent factors including military developments, individual decisions by key leaders, and international responses to German policies. Understanding this combination of inevitable structural problems and contingent historical developments is crucial for learning lessons that might help prevent similar catastrophes in the future. The immediate aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse left German youth in a state of profound confusion and trauma that would shape their entire generation. The teenagers who had been systematically prepared for military service and ideological conformity suddenly found themselves in a world where everything they had been taught was considered false or criminal. Many struggled with basic questions of identity and purpose, having been trained to derive their self-worth from service to a regime that no longer existed. Those who stepped into the vacuum left by Nazi collapse included Allied occupation authorities, religious organizations, and democratic German leaders who faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding youth development institutions from scratch. The Allied Control Council immediately disbanded all Nazi youth organizations and began the process of creating alternative institutions. But this left millions of young Germans without any organized social support or guidance during a period of massive social upheaval. The short-term consequences were both practical and psychological. On the practical level, German teenagers who had been prepared for military service or domestic support of the war effort found themselves completely unprepared for civilian life in a democratic society. They lacked the educational background, professional skills, and social experience necessary for productive citizenship in a peaceful, pluralistic society. The psychological consequences were equally severe. Many German young people experienced profound disillusionment as they realized that the adults they had trusted had systematically deceived them. Others struggled with guilt and shame as they came to understand their own participation in a movement that had committed atrocities. Still others remained loyal to Nazi ideology and resented Allied occupation as unjust foreign domination. Contemporary reactions varied dramatically depending on individual circumstances and family backgrounds. Young people from families that had privately opposed Nazi ideology often experienced relief and vindication, but they also struggled to rebuild relationships with peers who had enthusiastically supported the regime. Those from strongly Nazi families often felt abandoned and betrayed by parents and leaders who could no longer provide guidance or support. The attempts at revival or continuation took various forms, from organized efforts by surviving Nazi officials to maintain influence in exile, to informal networks of true believers who hoped that Nazi ideology would eventually be restored to power. Some Hitler Youth veterans formed underground groups that promoted modified versions of Nazi ideas while avoiding direct association with the discredited regime. Religious and democratic organizations worked desperately to provide alternative frameworks for youth development, but they faced enormous challenges in reaching young people who had been systematically conditioned to distrust any authority that didn't reinforce Nazi ideology. The process of building new institutions required not just creating new programs and policies, but overcoming years of indoctrination that had taught German youth to view democratic values as weakness and compromise as betrayal. The immediate legacy of Nazi youth policies was a generation of Germans who would spend decades struggling to understand their own experiences and to build healthy relationships with their children and grandchildren. The damage extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, influencing German society's approach to education, youth development, and political participation for generations to come. The legacy of Nazi youth policy shaped not just post-war Germany, but the entire international approach to children's rights, education, and protection from political exploitation. The systematic indoctrination and militarization of German youth became a defining example of what happens when societies fail to protect young people from adult political ambitions. And the lessons learned from this catastrophe influenced everything, from international law to educational philosophy. In terms of immediate historical impact, the Nazi youth experiment provided crucial evidence for the Nuremberg trials and subsequent international legal proceedings that established new standards for crimes against humanity. The documentation of how German children had been systematically prepared for aggressive war and genocide helped establish legal principles that made the recruitment and use of child soldiers a war crime under international law. The specific influences on later developments were profound and far-reaching. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, included explicit protections for children that were directly informed by Nazi abuses. The Geneva Conventions established clear prohibitions against involving civilians, especially children, in military operations. And the eventual Convention on the Rights of the Child drew heavily on lessons learned from the Nazi period about the vulnerability of young people to adult manipulation. How later generations viewed the Nazi youth experiment evolved significantly over time. In the immediate post-war period, there was a tendency to view German teenagers primarily as victims who had been deceived and exploited by adult leaders. But as more information became available about the active participation of young people in Nazi crimes, scholars began to develop more complex understandings that recognized both the victimization and the agency of German youth. The myths versus realities that developed around this topic became important factors in post-war German identity formation. Some Germans promoted narratives that emphasized how children had been innocent victims of adult manipulation, while others acknowledged the active role that many young people had played in supporting Nazi policies. These competing narratives influenced everything from educational curricula to family conversations about wartime experiences. Why this topic remained important to some groups while being forgotten by others reveals interesting patterns about collective memory and historical consciousness. Holocaust survivors and their descendants maintain focus on Nazi youth policies as part of broader efforts to document and remember Nazi crimes. Educational institutions in democratic countries use the Nazi example to illustrate the importance of protecting children from political exploitation. But in some contexts, there were deliberate efforts to minimize or forget these aspects of Nazi history because they raised uncomfortable questions about adult responsibility and institutional failure. The continuing scholarly and popular interest in Nazi youth policies reflects both the historical significance of these events and their relevance to contemporary concerns about education, media influence, and political socialization. Researchers continue to discover new documentation about how Nazi youth organizations operated, and these findings regularly influence current debates about protecting children from harmful ideological influences. Perhaps most importantly, the Nazi youth experiment established a clear historical precedent that helps modern societies recognize when children are being exploited for political purposes. The systematic documentation of Nazi methods provides a template for identifying similar patterns in other contexts, making it harder for future movements to disguise political exploitation as beneficial youth development. When we see organizations that isolate young people from alternative viewpoints while combining genuine social benefits with ideological conditioning, we have historical knowledge that helps us understand what might be happening and why we should be concerned. Today, we can see echoes of Nazi youth indoctrination techniques in contexts ranging from extremist political movements to commercial marketing targeted at children, and the parallels are often disturbingly precise. The basic methods that the Nazis used to manipulate young minds, combining genuine benefits with gradual ideological conditioning, exploiting adolescent desires for belonging and purpose, and using peer pressure to enforce conformity, remain standard approaches for anyone seeking to influence young people's beliefs and behaviors. Modern extremist movements, whether political or religious, regularly employ tactics that directly mirror Nazi youth organization strategies. They offer exciting activities, strong social bonds, and clear answers to complex questions while gradually introducing more extreme ideological elements. They exploit young people's natural idealism and desire to be part of something meaningful, just as the Hitler Youth did. And they use the same techniques of isolating members from alternative viewpoints while reinforcing group loyalty through shared experiences and mutual surveillance. The specific parallels are sometimes shockingly direct. Contemporary terrorist organizations recruit teenagers using summer camps that combine outdoor activities with ideological training, exactly as the Hitler Youth did. Online extremist communities use gaming, music, and social media to create spaces where young people can form friendships while being exposed to radical ideologies, following the same pattern of mixing social benefits with political indoctrination. Even in democratic societies, we can see concerning examples of how educational and youth development institutions can be manipulated to serve adult political agendas rather than young people's developmental needs. School districts that introduce partisan political content into curricula, youth organizations that prioritize ideology over individual growth, and social media platforms that exploit adolescent psychology for commercial purposes all follow patterns that were perfected by Nazi youth organizations. What hasn't changed about human nature is young people's fundamental need for belonging, purpose, and guidance during the transition from childhood to adulthood. Teenagers are still naturally idealistic, still eager to be part of something larger than themselves, and still vulnerable to manipulation by adults who are willing to exploit these developmental characteristics. The psychological and social Dynamics that made Nazi youth programs so effective remain constant across cultures and historical periods. Sound familiar? The similar patterns in different contexts reveal how universal these manipulation techniques actually are. Child soldier recruitment in various African conflicts has followed almost identical patterns of combining ideological indoctrination with military training, while exploiting young people's desire for status and belonging. Religious extremist movements around the world use comparable methods of isolating young people from mainstream society, while providing alternative communities that offer both social support and ideological conditioning, even seemingly benign. Examples like intensive academic competition, elite sports programs, or entertainment industry training can exhibit concerning parallels when they prioritize institutional goals over individual welfare and use psychological manipulation techniques to ensure compliance. The line between beneficial youth development and harmful exploitation often depends more on the motivations and methods of adult leaders than on the apparent nature of the activities themselves. Contemporary issues that directly connect to the Nazi youth experience include ongoing debates about educational content, parental rights, and the role of technology in young people's lives. Parents who worry about their children being exposed to political indoctrination in schools are responding to legitimate concerns that were validated by the Nazi experience. Educators who emphasize critical thinking and media literacy are applying lessons learned from studying how German children were systematically deceived. The rise of social media and digital technology has created new opportunities for the kind of large-scale youth manipulation that the Nazis pioneered with traditional media and organizational structures. Online platforms can expose young people to extreme ideologies, create echo chambers that reinforce harmful beliefs, and use sophisticated psychological techniques to influence behavior in ways that would have been impossible in the 1930s and 1940s. Perhaps most importantly, the Nazi youth experience demonstrates that protecting children from political exploitation requires constant vigilance and institutional safeguards that prioritize young people's developmental needs over adult political ambitions. The same societies that produced the Nazi catastrophe had previously been known for their educational achievements and cultural sophistication, proving that no society is immune to the possibility of sacrificing children's welfare for adult political goals. Even now, the Nazi youth experiment continues to influence multiple areas of modern life in ways that are both obvious and subtle. In academic study, the systematic documentation of Nazi youth policies provides essential case study material for understanding political socialization, institutional manipulation, and the vulnerability of young people to ideological exploitation. Universities around the world use Nazi youth organizations as examples in courses on education, psychology, political science, and human rights. In popular culture, the image of uniformed German youth marching in formation has become a universal symbol of totalitarian control and lost innocence. Films, books, and television programs regularly reference Nazi youth policies as shorthand for the complete perversion of normal child development by political extremism. This cultural presence helps maintain public awareness of these historical events while sometimes oversimplifying their complexity. Political discourse continues to be shaped by references to Nazi youth indoctrination whenever discussions arise about education, children's rights, or the proper role of government in young people's lives. Politicians and activists across the political spectrum invoke Nazi comparisons to argue against policies they view as threatening to parental authority or individual freedom. Though these comparisons are often historically inaccurate or inappropriate, social movements, particularly those focused on children's rights and educational reform, explicitly draw on lessons learned from the Nazi period to advocate for protections against political exploitation of young people. Organizations that monitor hate groups and extremist movements use knowledge gained from studying Nazi youth organizations to identify and counter contemporary efforts to recruit and radicalize teenagers. The influence extends even to practical policies and procedures in modern democratic institutions. Many countries have laws that specifically prohibit political indoctrination in schools, require parental consent for certain educational activities, and mandate that children receive exposure to diverse viewpoints rather than single ideological perspectives. These policies directly reflect lessons learned from studying how Nazi youth organizations systematically eliminated alternative sources of information and authority. International humanitarian organizations that work to protect children in conflict zones regularly reference Nazi precedents when advocating for stronger protections against child soldier recruitment and youth militarization. The legal frameworks that govern these efforts were largely developed in response to Nazi crimes, and they continue to evolve as new forms of youth exploitation emerge in different global contexts. Why people still care about these historical events reflects both their ongoing relevance to contemporary challenges and their power as examples of how quickly and completely normal institutions can be transformed to serve harmful purposes when appropriate safeguards are absent. Looking back across our journey through the teenage experience in Nazi Germany, we've seen how a society that claimed to honor and protect its youth systematically exploited and destroyed an entire generation of young people. We've witnessed the transformation of normal educational and youth development institutions into instruments of indoctrination and military recruitment. We've followed the stories of individual teenagers who navigated impossible choices between conformity, resistance, and simple survival. The key patterns that emerge from this examination are both disturbing and instructive. We've seen how totalitarian movements can successfully exploit young people's natural idealism and desire for belonging while gradually introducing increasingly extreme ideological elements. We've observed how quickly and completely normal institutions can be transformed to serve political rather than developmental purposes when appropriate safeguards are absent. And we've documented how the systematic abuse of children's trust and vulnerability can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims to influence entire societies for generations. Perhaps most surprising was discovering how many German teenagers found genuine positive experiences within Nazi youth organizations, even as those same organizations were preparing them for participation in genocide and aggressive war. The Hitler Youth programs that provided adventure, friendship, and leadership opportunities were simultaneously conditioning participants to suppress empathy, critical thinking, and moral reasoning. This combination of real benefits with systematic manipulation made Nazi indoctrination particularly effective and particularly traumatic when participants eventually understood what had been done to them. Our most important takeaways center on the vulnerability of young people to adult manipulation and the responsibility that societies had to protect children from political exploitation. The Nazi experience demonstrates that even intelligent, idealistic teenagers from educated families can be systematically deceived when trusted. Institutions fail to maintain their proper developmental focus. It shows how quickly social norms can change when political movements successfully gain control of educational and youth development systems. The evolution of our understanding throughout this examination has moved from initial focus on the obvious victims, Jewish children and active resistors, to recognition of the broader tragedy that affected millions of German young people who were simultaneously victims and perpetrators. We've come to understand that the Nazi youth experiment represented not just the abuse of individual children, but the systematic perversion of the institutions and relationships that societies depend on to transmit values and prepare young people for productive citizenship. How understanding has evolved through our discussion reveals the complexity that challenges simple narratives about good and evil, victim and perpetrator, resistance and collaboration. Real teenagers living through these events faced choices that often had no clearly moral options, and many found themselves trapped in situations where any decision could have devastating consequences for themselves and their families. Understanding this complexity is essential for learning lessons that can help prevent similar catastrophes while maintaining empathy for the human beings who live through these impossible circumstances. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discussed tonight. In the spring of 1945, as Berlin was falling to Allied forces, a 16-year-old Hitler Youth member named Werner was manning an anti-aircraft gun position on the roof of a government building. He had volunteered for this assignment, genuinely believing he was protecting his family and homeland from enemy invasion. Werner had spent 6 years in Nazi youth organizations, had formed deep friendships with other members, and had absorbed lessons about duty, courage, and sacrifice that seemed to give meaning to his dangerous situation. As Soviet artillery shells exploded around his position, Werner found himself thinking not about Nazi ideology or racial superiority, but about his mother, who was hiding in a basement somewhere in the city, and his younger sister, who had been evacuated to the countryside months earlier. He realized that the war was lost, that his death would serve no purpose beyond postponing inevitable defeat, and that the leaders who had sent him to this rooftop had already abandoned the city to save themselves. But Werner also understood that everything he had been taught about honor and loyalty demanded that he remain at his post. The friendships he had formed, the promises he had made, and the identity he had constructed around service to his country all pointed towards staying and fighting rather than abandoning his position to seek safety. At 16 years old, he faced a choice between personal survival and everything he had been conditioned to believe about his obligations to others. Werner's story reveals the broader themes that have run through our entire discussion tonight. He was simultaneously a victim of systematic indoctrination and an active participant in a military machine that was fighting to preserve a regime built on genocide and aggression. He had experienced genuine positive relationships and meaningful personal growth within an organization that was fundamentally evil in its ultimate purposes. He faced impossible moral choices that had been created by adult decisions he had no role in making. What happened to Werner that spring morning encapsulates the human cost of what Nazi Germany did to its youth. Whether he chose to stay and fight, to abandon his position and seek safety, or was killed before he could make any choice at all, he was a casualty of a system that had systematically betrayed every obligation that adults have to protect and nurture young people. His individual tragedy was multiplied millions of times across Germany as an entire generation found themselves trapped in situations where there were no good options and where the consequences of adult political failures fell most heavily on those who had no voice in creating them. This story connects to everything we've discussed because it shows how Nazi youth policies ultimately created a society where teenagers routinely faced choices that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances. Werner's dilemma was the logical endpoint of a process that began with seemingly innocent activities like camping trips and sports competitions, but gradually transformed into systematic preparation for war and genocide. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes is that it reveals how the regime succeeded, precisely because it built on authentic human virtues while directing them toward destructive ends. The human elements that make Werner's story compelling, his love for his family, his loyalty to his friends, his genuine courage in facing danger, were the same qualities that made Nazi Youth organizations so effective at indoctrinating participants. Understanding this paradox is essential for recognizing how similar manipulation might operate in different contexts and for developing effective protections against the political exploitation of young people's natural idealism and desire for belonging. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through one of history's darkest chapters, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from these stories about protecting the young people in our own lives and communities. The teenagers who lived through Nazi Germany were not fundamentally different from young people today. They had the same needs for belonging, purpose, and guidance that every generation experiences during the transition from childhood to adulthood. What made their experience tragic was not their individual failings, but the systematic failure of adult institutions to protect them from political exploitation. The lesson for us is not that young people are inherently vulnerable to manipulation, but that societies must maintain constant vigilance to ensure that educational and youth development institutions serve developmental rather than political purposes. Take a moment to appreciate the freedoms and protections that we often take for granted: the ability to question authority, to form friendships across social boundaries, to imagine different futures, and to grow up without being systematically prepared for war or hatred. These are precious gifts that require active protection and conscious effort to maintain. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey through the experiences of teenagers in Nazi Germany. Until next time, take care of yourselves and especially the young people in your lives.